Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Over the last decade or so, really, I've been focused pretty intensely on the potential implications of robotics and artificial intelligence. And I've really come around to the view that we could well be on the leading edge of just a very significant disruption. And I think it's a disruption that's going to completely transform the way businesses compete. And ultimately, it could also put a tremendous amount of stress both on society and on the economy. And the central idea that I'm focusing on is that machines, algorithms, computers are increasingly going to substitute for human workers. These things are going to take over more and more of the work now being done by people, and I think that ultimately that could lead to some real challenges for us. Now, during the course of my research, I've had a chance to talk to a lot of the people that are really on the leading edge of these technologies, the people really driving the innovation in robotics and in AI. And what I found is that at least among that technical group of people, there is something of what you might call an emerging consensus that maybe we really are headed toward this major disruption, or maybe we're headed toward an entirely new era where things are going to simply operate according to different rules from what we've seen in the past. On the other hand, there is a fair amount of skepticism still out there about this idea that maybe this time is really different. And I think it's probably fair to say that economists, for example, as a group are fairly skeptical. And the skepticism is largely based on the historical record. It turns out that this idea that machines might displace lots of workers and maybe create unemployment, it goes back at least 200 years to the Luddite revolts that, of course, happened here in England. And since then, that same concern has come up again and again. I'm going to guess that most of you have probably never heard of the Triple Revolution report. But this was actually a very prominent report. It was put together by a brilliant group of people. It included 2 Nobel laureates. And this report was presented to the President of the United States. And it said that the US was on the brink of complete social and economic upheaval because industrial automation was going to put millions of people out of work. Now, that report was delivered to President Lyndon Johnson in March of 1964. So that's now over 50 years ago, and of course that hasn't really happened yet. And that's been the story again and again. You know, this alarm has been raised, but so far at least it's always turned out to be a false alarm. My argument is that, you know, just because it's been a false alarm in the past doesn't mean it always will be. And I think that while it's certainly reasonable to be skeptical, there are also, you know, it's also important to keep a very open mind about this. So what I want to do is begin by giving you one number that I think kind of stands out and perhaps suggests that maybe something really interesting and different is happening this time. If you go back to 1998, in the business sector of the US economy, there was a total of 194 billion hours of labor performed. That's as measured by the government agency that tracks those things. Now, if you go forward 15 years to the year 2013, over that 15-year period, the output of the business sector grew over 40%, or about $3.5 trillion. And during that same 15-year period, the US population grew by about 40 million people. I mean, that's a lot of people. That's roughly equal to the population of Poland, which is one of the largest countries in the EU. So basically, that's like adding a whole nother country to the population of the United States. But we get to 2013, and it turns out that the amount of labor that was demanded by businesses in the business sector was still exactly the same, 194 billion hours of labor. It didn't increase at all despite that massive increase in output and all those millions of new people that entered both the population and the workforce. So to me, that's fairly remarkable, and that, I think, suggests that businesses are increasingly relying on what we might call digital leverage. In other words, they're utilizing all this powerful information technology to produce more and more, and they're relying more on that and less on human labor. And as that process continues to accelerate, I think that that could result in some real challenges for us. So given that I'm arguing that this time is really different, I think it's important to articulate just what's different about today's information technology relative to what we've seen in the past. And I would point to 3 fundamental things. And the first thing is that we have, of course, had this ongoing process of exponential acceleration. I think most of you have heard of Moore's law, or this idea that computing power roughly doubles every 2 years or so. But actually, it's broader than that. It extends to communications bandwidth and to software, which in some cases has accelerated at an even faster rate. But the really key thing to understand is that this acceleration has now been going on for a long time. It's been going on, in fact, for decades. If you measure from the late 1950s, when the first integrated circuits were fabricated, we've seen something on the order of 30 doublings in computing power since then, which is just an extraordinary number of times to double anything. And what it leads to is that we're now at a point where we just see an extraordinary amount of absolute progress. Things are moving at an astonishing rate already, and of course they're going to continue to accelerate from this point. So what that implies, I think, is that as we look forward in the coming years and decades, we're going to see things that really astonish us, things that we're not quite prepared for. And the reason is this ongoing acceleration. The second key thing is that in a limited way, at least, the machines are starting to think. And by this, I don't mean science fiction, artificial intelligence, or human-level AI, but rather just that the machines and the algorithms are making decisions, they're solving problems, and most importantly, they're learning. In fact, if there is one technology that is truly central to this and really has become the driving force behind it and has become incredibly broad-based and disruptive, it's machine learning, which is this idea that algorithms churn through data, and based on that, they can learn, they can figure things out. It's just become an extraordinarily disruptive and broad-based technology. And one of the best examples I've seen of that recently was what happened here in the UK last year with Google's DeepMind division. They built a system that you probably heard of called AlphaGo that was able to prevail at the ancient game of Go, and that ultimately defeat the world's best player at that. When you think about the game of Go, there are a couple of things that really stand out to me. One is that the game is just extraordinarily complex relative to chess. As you're playing the game, the number of configurations that the board can be in is basically infinite. There are more possibilities than there are atoms in the universe. So what that means is that you can never build a computer to win at the game of Go the way chess was approached, which was just to throw brute force computational power at it and then look ahead and figure out all the possibilities. You can't do that with a game of Go. There are just too many possibilities. So you need a more sophisticated approach. The second thing that really stands out is that if you talk to one of the champion Go players and try to understand what they're doing, this person can't necessarily even tell you exactly what they're thinking as they play the game. Many times it's just kind of a feeling that they have that they should make a particular move. It's very intuitive. So if you imagine, for example, that you're a computer programmer interviewing this person to try to figure out what they're doing and then somehow put that into code, you wouldn't even know how to start. So given just those two facts about the game, it would seem to me that this ought to be something that should not have been automated. This ought to be a task or a job that is safe for human beings. And yet, Google was able to build this system that not only learned to play the game by playing games against itself, but ultimately became superhuman. So I think that really should raise a cautionary flag for us. It should tell us that a lot of things that we now perceive as being safe from automation and reserved for people are probably going to be susceptible. A lot of our assumptions about the kinds of jobs and tasks that can be automated are almost certainly going to be challenged in the future. The third important thing is that information technology and increasingly artificial intelligence is becoming a true general purpose technology. By that, I simply mean it's going to be everywhere. It's going to invade every sector of the economy, every industry. It's going to impact everything. A number of people have compared information technology to electricity. It's like a utility. Now, you would never ask what industry is most impacted by electricity. I mean, that's kind of a silly question. Everything relies on electricity. And the same is going to be true of artificial intelligence. So it's really just going to scale across everything. And again, that's going to be incredibly disruptive. One thing that many people who are perhaps a bit skeptical about this will be quick to point out is that there is this ongoing process of creative destruction. So we can all agree that many industries and businesses that exist today are probably going to be upended by technology. Maybe they'll even be destroyed, they'll disappear. But at the same time, the progress of technology is, of course, going to create entirely new things. And we can easily anticipate what some of those new industries are going to be, things like nanotechnology and virtual reality and synthetic biology and so forth. Those new sectors are certainly going to arise, and they will have to, of course, hire people. But there is, I think, a fair amount of evidence to suggest that they're probably not going to be labor intensive. There simply may not be that many jobs there. And what you see on this particular slide is a comparison of a very traditional industry as exemplified by General Motors. And at its peak employment, General Motors had about 840,000 workers. Now compare that to Google in 2012, and after adjusting for inflation, Google actually earned 20% more than General Motors ever did, but it did so with a workforce that was less than 5% the size of General Motors. So it's really just a tiny sliver of the employment that GM had. And of course, there's also a big difference in the kinds of workers that Google versus GM hires. I mean, General Motors created a tremendous number of opportunities for typical average people. Google, there's a lot fewer jobs, and they're really geared toward much more elite, highly educated, capable people. I mean, very often people, for example, that have gone to the world's very best universities and so forth and really have very high levels of technical skill. So as we look forward, the point here is that I think gradually we can expect that the whole economy is going to come to look more like Google and less like General Motors. And that ultimately could mean an absolute shortfall in the number of jobs out there, as well as a skill mismatch problem where, you know, the new jobs that are created are not necessarily going to be accessible to a lot of average workers in our workforce. Here's another graph that shows a somewhat similar idea. This is also about what you might call creative destruction, but now I'm focused on occupations rather than industries. One thing that you'll hear people say very often is that, yes, you know, technology might destroy a lot of the jobs that exist today, but of course they're going to be entirely new kinds of work. They're going to be things that, you know, kinds of occupations and jobs that maybe today we can't even imagine. And that's certainly true. You can already think of a number of kinds of work that not too long ago people wouldn't have been able to anticipate. Think of website designers, social media marketers, data scientists, and so forth. These are all new kinds of work. So those new opportunities absolutely do exist. But what I'm showing on this particular chart here, if you look at the bar chart on the right here, it shows that while these new occupations do exist, they really aren't a big fraction of employment. It turns out that in the United States, about 90% of the workforce is engaged in occupations that existed 100 years ago. So that would be things like driving vehicles, preparing and serving food, working in retail stores, working in healthcare, working in warehouses and factories, and, you know, doing routine things in offices and so forth. These are all occupations that someone in the year 1915 would have been quite familiar with. So we are creating some new jobs, but they're really pretty small. Most people still work in those traditional areas. And of course, it's quite clear, just looking ahead, that many of those traditional occupations are going to be disrupted. Just to take one kind of obvious examples, think of the impact of self-driving vehicles, both cars and trucks. I mean, that's going to be millions and millions of jobs for taxi drivers and Uber drivers and truck drivers, lorry drivers, and all the rest. So that's just an enormous impact just thinking of that one example. But of course, it's not just that one example. It's also going to be fast food jobs, and it's going to be routine office jobs and all the rest of it. So as you think about that disruption that's coming, I think it's reasonable to wonder whether there are really going to be enough new opportunities created in entirely new areas, and once again, whether those new jobs are really going to be accessible to the people that are now driving taxis and trucks and so forth. So again, we could have that skill mismatch issue. So let me now go over some economic data that I think suggests technology is already having an impact on the job market and the economy. What you see here is a comparison of productivity and average compensation in the United States. Productivity, of course, is an efficiency measure. It's basically equal to the value of what we produce divided by the number of hours that it takes to produce it. Now, if you look at this graph, you see that right up until the mid-1970s, the two lines move together perfectly. They're perfectly correlated. Now, if you look in any economics textbook, it'll tell you this is the way things should work. The idea is that technological progress creates better tools for workers to use. Those workers become more effective, more productive, and as a result, those workers ought to become more valuable, and then they can command higher wages. And so productivity and wages both, they rise in line with each other, and that's exactly what happened right up until 1973 or so. But you see then these two lines effectively decouple, and compensation has stagnated for workers. Some groups of workers in the United States now actually make less after adjusting for inflation than they did in the 1970s. At the same time, productivity has continued to climb, so we've got this big gap opening up. Now, I personally think that if you look at this graph, this explains to some extent why Donald Trump is now in the Oval Office and creating lots of drama there. I think that many people have the sense that they are being left behind, that they're not participating in progress, and they are absolutely correct. That this graph really demonstrates that quite vividly. And you can see the inset there for the UK. The decoupling happens a bit later, but the basic shape and the basic phenomenon of this gap opening up is essentially the same. So this, I think, is a graph, a phenomenon that has already created some political disruption and is likely to create much more. Essentially, what this is saying is that all the fruits of innovation, of progress, are accruing to the people at the top, to business owners, executives, investors, and so forth, and almost none of that is ending up in the pockets of average workers. I think that one of the main things that's driving this is that the nature of our technology is changing. At one time, machines were clearly tools. They were something that workers operated, and they made those workers more effective and more valuable. But increasingly, machines are now substituting for workers. And that means rather than complementing them and making them more valuable, in some cases at least, they're substituting for those workers and making the workers actually less valuable. And that's one of the things that I think is causing this big gap to open up in this graph. Here's a graph showing what job creation looks like in the United States over roughly the last half decade. This shows new jobs in percentage terms in each decade, and you can see it looks like a declining staircase. Just about every decade has created fewer new jobs in percentage terms than the preceding decade. So to me, this is an indication that some structural shift is happening in the economy, and I think certainly the prime candidate as the culprit that's causing that is technology. Here's another graph that looks almost like the mirror image of that one. And this is looking at what happens in recessions. Now, when we have a recession, millions of jobs are, of course, lost. Eventually, the economy recovers, and those jobs are regenerated, at least in number, so that total employment gets back to the same point that it was at the beginning of the recession. This graph is showing for recent recessions how long that takes in months. And you can see it's getting longer and longer. This is the story of jobless recoveries. It's almost as though the job market is kind of losing its elasticity, its ability to spring back to where it was before. So again, I think technology is the main thing driving that. The other thing that's going on here is that when the jobs do come back, they're not really the same jobs as the ones that disappeared. It turns out that when we have a recession, the first jobs to really get vaporized are the good, solid, middle-skill, middle-class jobs. So these are jobs that require some amount of training, but not an excessive amount, and really provide a good, solid, reliable, middle-class income. Those jobs disappear right away, and when the number of jobs finally returns, what we see is they're weighted quite heavily toward less desirable jobs. In the service sector, working at McDonald's or working at a retail store like Walmart, those kinds of jobs often are not full-time, they don't have reliable incomes, they have very little in the way of fringe benefits and so forth. So they're less desirable. And together with that, you have a much smaller number of elite jobs that really require lots of training. So this is the process of what we call job market polarization or hollowing out. And it's been observed in many countries, including the UK and other countries in Europe, as well as the United States. So it's a global phenomenon. And once again, I think that technology is certainly the primary culprit for this. So I think there's plenty of evidence to show that technology is already having an important part or an important impact on the job market, and we can expect that to be magnified in the future. So let me talk a bit now about some of the actual technologies that are driving all of this. Now, robots have been around for a long time. If you had gone into, say, an automotive factory back in the 1980s, you would already have seen these big, powerful industrial robots, and these are incredibly fast, precise, strong machines. And what that has meant is that in developed countries, all of the true rote, repetitive assembly line type jobs where you literally stand there and just do the same thing again and again, most of those jobs have disappeared already. So what has been left in most manufacturing environments have been jobs that to some extent are unpredictable. They rely on things like visual perception and dexterity. Examples might be loading and unloading trucks at a factory, or picking parts out of a bin and feeding it into the next machine. These are the kinds of jobs that up until now machines have not been able to do, so they've been saved for people. But that is something that's changing. And what you see in the photograph here is a picture of a robot built by a company called Industrial Perception in Silicon Valley. And this was a startup company, but it's actually now been purchased by Google, so this technology is part of Google now. But you can see that they built a robot, and it just looks like kind of a robotic arm. But at the end of that arm is a machine vision camera, and it's in this illustration, you can see it approaching this stack of boxes, and you'll notice that the boxes aren't stacked precisely. You know, there are gaps, some are rotated, there are different shapes and sizes and colors, and some have text on them and so forth. Up until very recently, figuring out how to move these boxes and then moving them would have been a visual perception and dexterity challenge that only a human being would have been able to solve. But this company has built a robot that will be able to do it, and they anticipate that eventually it will be able to move about 1 box every second. And that would compare to about 1 box every 6 seconds for a productive human worker. So you can see right there how that's going to be disruptive. And of course, this is a robot that will work continuously. It's never going to get tired. It's never going to injure its back. It's never going to file a workers' compensation claim. So as this technology gets more affordable, more available, more reliable and so forth, it's clearly going to be disruptive. More and more businesses are going to rely on this to do this kinds of work, and that's going to threaten the jobs and the livelihoods of a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people that do this kind of work. And of course, those are going to tend to be people that don't have very high levels of skill and education. Now, there's kind of a conventional way of thinking about this, which I think is correct, and that says that if you've got a job where you're working on a loading dock and every day you're lifting these heavy boxes, that's not a terrific job. That's a job that quite likely is going to end up getting you injured. People that do that kind of work, for years and decades very often end up disabled so that they're unable to work again at all. So in an important sense, if someone can build a robot to take over this work, that's not something we should be upset about. That's something that perhaps we should celebrate. And of course, there has always been a solution to that problem. And the solution is that you take the worker that loses that job and you send that person back to school or for some more training, some more education. And the idea is that that person can then move up the skills ladder. Perhaps they can do something more sophisticated, more cognitive. Maybe they end up working in a more comfortable, safer work environment. Perhaps they end up working in an office rather than on the loading dock, and then they don't have to worry about injuring themselves. What I want to show you here is the reason that that way of thinking or that particular solution to the problem may not be sustainable in the future. This is an article that appeared recently in the Wall Street Journal, and it's focused on white-collar automation. And it's focusing particularly on the corporate finance department in the largest U.S. corporations. So corporate finance would be jobs like accounting, financial planning, accounts receivable and payable clerks, these types of jobs. And if you look at the bar chart on the right, what you see is that over a 10-year period recently, about 40% of those jobs disappeared. And that's relative to the revenue of the corporation. In other words, number of jobs per million dollars of revenue. So nearly half of those jobs have disappeared, and it's because of smart software, which is increasingly taking on this more routine work. Now, there are many, many examples you can point to of how these technologies, especially machine learning, is really climbing that skills level or the skills ladder and beginning to impact work that's being done by people with university degrees. So it's not just about blue-collar, less skilled work anymore. For example, there are systems that can tap into a stream of data and automatically generate a news story. And by one account, every 30 seconds, there's a story published that is machine generated. And you can read one of those stories, and it's not at all obvious that it's written by a machine and not by a human journalist. In the field of law, there are algorithms that are doing document review and replacing a lot of the work that used to be done by lawyers and paralegals. An extreme example would be a radiologist. That's a medical doctor that looks at medical images, mammograms and x-rays and so forth. To do that job requires just an incredible amount of education. In the United States, you've got to go to university for 4 years, then medical school for 4 years, and then at least 5 years of training in a residency program after that before you can be a qualified radiologist to interpret visual images. But we've already seen a demonstration of computer systems that in some cases can outperform human doctors at, for example, recognizing tumors and cancer in mammograms. So I think that eventually radiology will be a job that's fully automated, despite the fact that it requires all that education. So here's a graph that shows that I think perhaps all of this may already be having an impact. This is showing the earnings for young university graduates in the United States. And what you see is that over a recent 10-year period, they've actually been going into decline after adjusting for inflation. So while it's still true that you're much better off to go to university and get that advanced degree than to not do that, you still end up more successful over the course of your life. It is not the case that things are necessarily fantastic, even for university graduates. In the US, we have a problem where about half of the people are coming out of school and can't necessarily find a position that really leverages their education. For example, a lot of people graduate and then they end up working at Starbucks, for example. So this is really, I think, a warning to us that this assumption that we can solve this problem just by giving everyone more education is maybe not valid, that we may eventually have to think outside the box and come up with another solution to all of this as machines get better and better at performing more skilled work. So I've talked a lot about what you might call as the kind of the challenging or the negative side of this, the fact that there's going to be such a big impact on jobs. I want to make sure I mention the positive side, of course, that all this innovation is going to bring us amazing things in the future. I think we're going to see some genuinely disruptive innovations happening across the board. And that's going to happen as a result of this vast increase in computational capacity that we have, as well as the way that we can leverage technologies like artificial intelligence in many different areas of the economy. One thing that a number of people have pointed out over the last half century or more is that technological progress seems to have been concentrated really into the area of computers and communications, and we've seen much less progress kind of across the board in other areas. The classic example is airline travel. I mean, the jetliners that we have today are really not fundamentally different than the ones we had in the 1970s. Certainly, they're not any faster. This kind of idea of stagnation in many areas has been captured, I think, pretty effectively by a famous quote from Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley, who said that we were promised flying cars and we ended up with 140 characters. And I think that kind of captures it well. But I do think that that's poised to change. And I want to give you an example, one company that I happen to be involved with. It's a company called Genesis Systems. It's a startup company, and I happen to be on the board of directors. But this is a company that is focused on atmospheric water generation, meaning that it's building a system to directly extract water from the air. Now, that's not a particularly new idea. That's basically how a dehumidifier works. But this company, Genesis, has developed a revolutionary technology, and they anticipate that within a year or so, they're going to have systems on the ground in some of the most arid regions of the world, in the Middle East and North Africa. And these will be self-powered systems, powered by, for example, solar power, and they will be able to generate water at industrial scale directly from the air without being having to have proximity to infrastructure or other sources of water and so forth. So you can see how that's going to be enormously disruptive. If that works, it will potentially be transformative in regions of the world where water is a substantial challenge. So I think that's very exciting. The reason that I became involved in this company is that I live in Silicon Valley, and I look around and I see way too many brilliant people there focused on social media, on figuring out how to share silly videos, and especially on how to get people to click on advertisements. And I think it's great that I think we're finally at the point where all of this technology is really beginning to have a much more broad-based impact in a lot of areas that really matter. So that's quite exciting. So the last thing that we would ever want to do is to put a stop to all this progress. So although I talk a lot about the challenges, it's very important to remember this upside and the fact that we want to keep all this progress moving forward. But there is, an important challenge here, not just socially. Obviously, if we do face a future with significant unemployment or lower incomes, then that's going to be a big social challenge. I mean, it's going to be a big challenge for families and individuals. But there is also a fundamental economic challenge there, in the sense that in order to have a vibrant market economy, you've got to have consumers, right? You've got to have people that have got the money to buy the products and services being produced. If you don't have that, then you run the risk of stagnation or maybe even a kind of a downward deflationary spiral. You can kind of visualize that by thinking in terms of a very rich person. Think about Bill Gates, for example. Now, Bill Gates has got, in theory, an infinite amount of purchasing power. He can buy anything he wants. But of course, he's not going to go out and buy 1,000 cars. He's not going to buy 1,000 smartphones. He's definitely not going to visit 1,000 restaurants and sit down and have dinner, 1,000 times in one night. So when you take purchasing power from 1,000 average people and instead concentrate that into the hands of one very wealthy person, you clearly take something out of the economy in terms of unit demand. And this, I think, could be a real challenge for us as this process accelerates. And in fact, as you look around the world today, in many developed countries, you see, relatively stagnant levels of growth. You see interest rates at zero and so forth. So I think there's some evidence to suggest that this might already be an issue. But certainly, as all of this continues to accelerate and the impact increases, it can be a substantial problem in terms of getting back on a path toward robust growth. So this is an issue that we all need to think a bit more about, I think. So finally, the question then becomes, what should we do about all of this? And there are really three levels that you can kind of think about it. If you are someone running a business, managing a business, I think it's kind of obvious that you have no choice but to embrace these technologies. You better start to understand about artificial intelligence and machine learning and what all of that can mean for your business and how you can leverage it, because if you fail to leverage it, you're going to become irrelevant because your competitors will take advantage of these technologies. So that's fairly easy to think in those terms. A second way to view it is, what should we all do as individuals to remain relevant? And I think that the most important advice I can give there is to avoid doing something that's fundamentally routine and repetitive and predictable. You know that any job of that kind, whether it's a blue-collar job or a white-collar job, is going to be susceptible. So what you want to do is move away from that and make sure that you're doing something, for example, that's genuinely creative, where you're building new things, or something where you're really working on a deep level with other people, whether that's perhaps in a caring role like healthcare, a nurse or doctor, for example, or in the business world if you're really working in a sophisticated way with clients and really building deep relationships. Those are the areas that are probably going to be least susceptible to automation. But the more important and interesting question is, what should we do as a society? And I think that you can imagine a very utopian outcome to this. You can imagine a world where perhaps we all have to work less, we've got more time for leisure, more time for our families, where no one has to do a dangerous job and so forth. And that's a great utopian vision. But I do think that while that's something that we should absolutely strive toward, it is also the case that we're almost certainly going to end up with an income distribution problem. I mean, it seems pretty evident that a lot of people are very likely to be left behind, and they're going to find it hard to find a foothold in the economy. So in order to solve that problem, I think ultimately we probably will have to find a way to decouple incomes from traditional work. And the best approach I know of is going to be some kind of a universal basic income or guaranteed income. And that's, at this point, certainly a fairly radical idea, not something that seems very politically feasible right now, but it is an idea that's getting a lot of traction throughout the world. There are some important pilot projects going on in countries like Finland and the Netherlands. And I do think it's an idea that's very important for the future, and that at some point we may get to the point where it's simply inevitable that we're going to have to move in that direction. But anyway, my purpose in coming and talking to you and also in writing about this is really to get you all thinking about this. I hope you'll start thinking about these issues, talking to others, and maybe engage in a sort of a public debate about what we need to do about all of this. And I hope that as we have that discussion, from that will emerge some practical solutions that will help us to ensure that we can build a future economy that works for everyone at every level of our society, and not just for a tiny, group of elite people at the top. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, for that lovely session. It got us thinking, and I think just sitting there in the audience, my mind was reeling on just the period of history that we've just come through and how that's really going to change now for the future for all of us. We had some questions on the live QA. If you haven't had a chance to ask questions, you can just go into your app right now, and you can either vote on the questions that are already there or ask a new question. But in order to get started, and while you're doing that, I have a question for you, Martin. As senior executives and leaders of organizations of shared services, and as an industry we employ thousands and thousands of people, what would be your directive to us as an audience, as leaders? What are the three things we should start doing, we should stop doing and we should continue doing?
Well, I think that generally you need to understand that if you're in the outsourcing business, then artificial intelligence is going to be a new source of labor, and you need to look at that as one of your inputs, I think. And I noticed that there are companies demonstrating customer service systems and so forth that are automated, so I think it's great that you're beginning to think in that way, but you have to think beyond just sourcing human labor and thinking in terms of sourcing the direct technology as well, because that's simply going to be another alternative. The other thing to understand that in terms of outsourcing work done by people, that if they're doing routine, repetitive, predictable things, then eventually that's going to disappear. That's going to be automated, and either that's going to happen with the participation of your industry, or it's going to be done by Google or someone else, outside your industry. So it's really important to be aware of that. So you want to find a way to shift your human resources to areas that are maybe less predictable and routine and so forth. So I think those are the main things that I would focus on.
Okay. So as the questions are popping in, so one of the most voted questions for you is, where do you see government influence go with robotics or taxing robots, for instance? Will savings be taken or considered by governments?
Well, I definitely think there's a role for government here, and we'll need to shift our taxation scheme, because right now we heavily tax labor, right? I mean, it's payroll taxes that support retirement and healthcare and all the rest of it. And if in fact jobs are going to disappear or jobs are going to pay less in the future, then it's harder and harder to raise that money by taxing labor. So we'll have to shift to something else, maybe more tax on business profits, or tax on capital, or more progressive tax on the wealthy people that are really benefiting from this. I don't specifically favor a robot tax, because it's very hard to know what a robot is. A lot of this is just software. I mean, how would you figure out exactly what you're going to tax? It's too complicated, I think, and also it would create disadvantages for particular nations that did that and others didn't, and so forth. So I generally wouldn't favor that.
Okay. Another question for you was, what would you advise a student entering university today?
Again, the best advice is don't train for an occupation that is fundamentally routine and repetitive. Think in terms of creativity, or think in terms of engagement with other people. Those are the fields and the skills that you want to pick up in your education. I do think there's probably a strong argument for having some flexibility as well. Make sure your education is broad-based enough so that in the future you'll be able to be very flexible and move to different areas, because I think everyone understands that no one's going to have one job that they keep for their whole career in the future.
Okay. Martin, last question, and of course we're going to have you later on in the stalls as well. The question is, what happens if for whatever reason you are unable to get on this journey and upskill your employees? What is going to happen to the thousands and thousands of people? Will they be left behind?
I think it's probably inevitable that a lot of people will be left behind. I mean, you have to be realistic. I mean, we can all do what we can. We can reform education to the extent possible. We can make lots of opportunities for people to retrain, but it's probably, given the size of the disruption that I see here, I think it's inevitable that some people are going to fail to make that transition. That's, for example, the reason that I talk about the need for a basic income or a guaranteed income. We have to provide a solution that works for everyone.
Thank you, Martin. We're going to give Martin a big round of applause. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Martin's going to join us at the book signing during the coffee break this morning between 10:30 and 11:10.